Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to It's Rainmaking Time. This is Kim Greenhouse. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Kathleen Marden to the show today to discuss a book that she has co-authored with Stanton Friedman called Captured, the true story of the world's first documented alien abduction, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO experience. This was the first heavily publicized alien abduction that happened on September 19th, 1961 to Betty and Barney Hill. Betty's niece, Kathleen Marden, is here today to talk to us about the book, the experience of Betty and Barney Hill, her background as a UFO and abduction researcher. She's also an author and a lecturer and a senior fellow of the Institute of Frontier Science, and a MUFON Director of Field Investigator Training, Emeritus. She has taken a big stand to bring this information forward, along with Stanton Friedman, as well as to transcribe all of the tapes that were available from Betty and Barney Hill's abduction experiences under hypnosis. A huge task, and I would imagine a difficult one. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Kathleen Marden to It's Rainmaking Time. Good morning.
Good morning.
Wow. Where to begin in all of this? Huge, huge, huge body of work. And I know that Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO experience, you have tapped the surface of what you're sitting on, really.
I have. I had a word limit, and therefore I could include only so much information in the book. I had actually gone about 30 to 35,000 words above my publisher's limit before I received it, so I had to condense some of that information and actually eliminate some of it. And so now I'm speaking about that at lectures and on radio programs and writing magazine articles about that.
First, I want to talk about your family experience being Betty's niece and your mother being her sister, about what your impressions were as a child growing up relative to Betty's experience or the way she articulated her experience and her husband's experience.
Well, I have to say, first of all, that I was 13 years old when this happened. So I was a teenager on September 19th, 1961. My Aunt Betty and my Uncle Barney had no previous interest, no prior interest in UFOs. It was not something that my family ever discussed. However, we did have an interest in the Soviet space program and the American space program and the space race. So when Betty and Barney returned home from their vacation to Niagara Falls and Montreal on September 20th, 1961, and Betty called my mother to report that they had had a close encounter with a large, hovering, silent craft the night before. I was very surprised. I had never heard about such a thing. In fact, I didn't know that there was life on other planets. I thought that Earth was the only inhabited planet. That's what I had learned in school. So it was really quite big news to me, but very, very interesting. And it sort of came out a little bit at a time with Betty and Barney. Within a couple of days of that phone call that Betty made to my mother, my family, my parents and my two brothers and I traveled the 20 miles from my home in Kingston, New Hampshire, to Betty's and Barney's home in Portsmouth on New Hampshire's seacoast. It was then that I saw some of the physical evidence that something really strange had happened to my aunt and uncle. Their watches had broken and never worked again after that night. Somehow it might have been related to the close encounter they had with this craft. The tops of my uncle's best dress shoes were scraped. There was no rational explanation for how this could have happened. He was seated in his car, driving from point A to point B. He had gotten out to look at this craft on 3 different occasions, but there was no prosaic explanation for how those shoes were so scraped that he had to wear them for yard work after that. Betty's dress had been in very fine condition the morning that she put it on in Canada. She had only been a passenger in the car. They had stopped to eat a couple of times. She had also gotten out on a couple of times to view this UFO. But when she arrived home, there were tears in the dress. And these were not just tiny tears. The lining was torn from waist to hemline. The hem was torn down on one side. There was a 1-inch tear at the top of the zipper on the back on one side and a 2-inch tear on the other side. There was no prosaic explanation for how this happened. Barney's binocular strap was broken. Well, there was a good explanation for that. He was very frightened when he was standing in that field looking up at this hovering craft that contained individuals that he described as strangely or non-human, or somehow non-human were his exact words. And they were dressed in black, shiny outfits. Those he remembered consciously. So he was frightened. He pulled the binoculars away from his eyes, and that's probably how the strap was broken and when it was broken. There were also shiny spots on the trunk of their 1957 Chevy. Now, the strange thing about these spots is that they hadn't been there the day before. They hadn't been there in the morning when they put their luggage into the trunk of the car after they stayed at a motel. But they were there when they arrived home. And those spots were all about the same size. They were about the size of a $50 or a silver dollar. There were several of them. They were concentric circles. And when a compass was placed over those spots, it would cause the needle to spin and spin. But when the compass was moved away, they would drop down. It would drop down. So I saw those spots. I saw that evidence. And I heard Betty's and Barney's story about what they recalled from that night, about getting out of the car, about looking through binoculars at this strange craft that appeared to be disc-shaped. At its closest approach, at first they thought it was cigar-shaped until they got a far better look at it. It appeared to have lighted windows on one side. It appeared to be rotating. It was silent. It flew in a very unconventional kind of pattern, in a stair-step pattern at times. It followed the topography of the tops of the mountains as it traveled along the top of the mountain through Franconia Notch in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. And it would drop down in front of the mountain at times and behind the mountain at times. But it seemed to be playing a game of cat and mouse with Betty and Barney as they traveled along. And, of course, there were those strange buzzing or beeping sounds on the trunk of their vehicle after Barney ran from that field where he had the close encounter and observed non-human entities on board the craft. He noticed that the craft had shifted overhead back over their vehicle as he was running to the car. As he went speeding down U.S. Highway Route 3, the major north-south route through New Hampshire, in that time frame, he and Betty heard a series of beeping or buzzing sounds